In the summer of 1943, 16-year-old Marguerite Dubois still collected eggs from her father's chickens each dawn, though half the flock had long since disappeared into German cooking pots. The ritual gave structure to days that had lost all meaning since the occupation began, but it could not silence the distant thunder of Allied bombers that shook the farmhouse walls 3 nights each week. Marguerite had learned to distinguish the different engines by sound: the deep rumble of British Lancasters heading east toward Germany, the higher pitch of American flying fortresses returning damaged from their missions. What she hadn't learned was how to stop counting them. 7 aircraft had passed overhead the night before. Only 6 had returned at dawn. Her father, Claude Dubois, moved through the barnyard with the careful deliberation of a man who understood that survival meant invisibility. For 18 months, he had perfected the art of being overlooked by German patrols, by collaborating neighbors, by anyone whose attention might bring questions about his missing livestock, his hoarded grain, or his daughter's habit of watching the skies. The farm sat in the valley between 2 hills, 12 kilometers south of the village of Saint-Trémy, in what had once been Free France, but was now simply occupied territory. German checkpoints controlled every road. A single Wehrmacht garrison occupied the old monastery on the eastern hill, close enough that Marguerite could see the sentries through her bedroom window, far enough that their presence felt like a constant weight rather than immediate threat. What Claude Dubois couldn't know that morning, as he watched his daughter scatter grain for chickens that no longer came when called, was that his 18 months of careful invisibility were about to end. The decision that would transform his family's life had already been made by a 23-year-old Royal Air Force pilot named James Morrison, somewhere over the Ardennes forest, when his Spitfire's engine began trailing black smoke and his altimeter showed a descent he could not control. Marguerite heard the aircraft before she saw it, a different sound than the steady formations that usually crossed their valley. This engine coughed and sputtered, its rhythm broken like a wounded animal's breathing. When she looked up from the chicken coop, the plane was diving at an angle that would bring it down somewhere beyond the western hill, in the forest where she had played as a child before the Germans came. The crash, when it came, sounded like thunder trapped in a box, a sharp crack followed by the groan of metal against stone, then silence that felt more ominous than the noise had been. Marguerite stood frozen in the farmyard, grain spilling from her hands, while her father emerged from the barn with the expression he wore when checking the road for German patrols. "Inside," Claude said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had survived the Great War before this one began. But Marguerite was already moving, not toward the house, but toward the path that led up the western hill, toward the smoke that was beginning to rise above the tree line. "The pilot," she said, the words emerging before she had fully formed the thought. "If he's alive." Claude caught her arm with a grip that revealed the strength still hidden in his aging farmer's frame. "If he's alive, he's not our responsibility." The logic was unassailable, hidden in the safety of well-practiced selfishness. A crashed Allied pilot meant German search parties, house-to-house inspections, questions they could not answer without revealing the small acts of resistance that had kept them fed through 2 winters of occupation. But Marguerite was already pulling free, her 16-year-old certainty cutting through her father's middle-aged caution. If he's alive, he's dying. What she couldn't articulate, standing there in the morning light with chicken grains scattered at her feet, was the rage that had been building inside her for 18 months. Rage at the Germans who had taken her brothers, one to a labor camp, one to a shallow grave beside the village church. Rage at the neighbors who had learned to look away when trucks came for Jewish families. Rage at herself for collecting eggs and feeding chickens while the world burned around their small valley. The pilot represented something she had almost forgotten existed. The possibility of action instead of endurance, of choice instead of acceptance. Claude released her arm, but his expression remained fixed on the smoke rising beyond the hill. 5 minutes, he said finally. "We look for 5 minutes. If he's dead, we come home. If he's alive." He left the sentence unfinished, but Marguerite understood. If the pilot was alive, they would face the choice between their safety and his survival, between the invisible life that had protected them and the visible courage that could destroy them. They climbed the western hill in silence, following the goat path Marguerite had known since childhood, now overgrown from 2 years of neglect. The forest felt different under occupation, quieter, as if the trees themselves had learned to muffle sound. Even the birds seemed to whisper their songs, afraid of drawing attention from the wrong listeners. The Spitfire had carved a scar through the forest floor, clipping 3 oak trees before embedding its nose in a granite outcrop that had probably stood since before the Romans built their roads through these hills. Steam rose from the twisted metal, carrying the scent of aviation fuel and burning rubber that would alert German search parties within the hour. James Morrison hung unconscious in his pilot's seat, held upright by leather straps that had probably saved his life, but now trapped him in a cockpit that had become a metal coffin. Blood ran from a gash across his forehead, disappearing into the leather of his flying jacket. His breathing came in shallow gasps that suggested internal injuries Claude's experience with wounded animals could recognize but not treat. "English," Marguerite whispered, reading the RAF insignia on the pilot's uniform. Not German, not French, not one of the faceless enemies or reluctant allies who had divided their world into categories of danger. English meant Royal Air Force, meant bombing runs against German factories, meant someone who had been fighting while she collected eggs and pretended the war existed somewhere else. Claude was already studying the forest around them with the calculating gaze he used for weather prediction and crop rotation. "Search parties will be here within the hour," he said. "They'll follow the smoke first, then spread out in circles. If we move him, we leave a trail. If we leave him, he dies of internal bleeding before they find him." The choice Marguerite had been unconsciously preparing for since the occupation began crystallized in the space between her father's words. Everything she had learned about survival under German rule argued for walking away, returning to their invisible farm, their careful routines, their practiced ignorance of everything beyond their own fence line. The pilot was already unconscious. He would die without ever knowing they had found him. No guilt, no consequences, no disruption of the safety they had built from 18 months of strategic cowardice. But something else lived in Marguerite now, something that had been growing since the night she watched German trucks take the Rosenbaum family from their house beside the baker's shop. Something that spoke louder than survival, more urgently than caution. "We take him," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "We take him home." Claude stared at his daughter as if she had suggested flying to London themselves. Take him where? Hide him how? Feed him with what? Each question carried the weight of practical impossibility, but Marguerite was already working at the pilot's restraining straps, her hands moving with the competence she had learned from helping birth calves and set broken bones in injured farm animals. "The root cellar," she said, not looking up from her work. "Behind the preserves, there's space. For a corpse, perhaps." But Claude was already moving to help her, his farmer's practicality overriding his caution when faced with his daughter's determination. Together they lifted James Morrison from the wreckage, his unconscious weight distributed between them in a way that suggested he might survive the short journey home. The pilot was lighter than Marguerite had expected, his frame lean from wartime rationing even in the RAF. His face, beneath the blood and dirt, looked younger than she had imagined enemy pilots to be, closer to her brother Paul's age than her father's. When they paused to rest halfway down the hill, Morrison's eyes opened briefly, unfocused and confused, before closing again without recognition of his surroundings. "Water," he whispered in English, the word clear enough that Marguerite understood both the request and its implications. A conscious pilot meant medical needs they couldn't meet, questions they couldn't answer, and a presence in their cellar that would require explanation if discovered. "Later," Claude murmured in French, hoping the tone would convey reassurance even if the words couldn't be understood. But Marguerite was already planning: water from the well, clean cloth from her mother's old linens, the bottle of antiseptic her father used for treating injured livestock. They reached the farmhouse, as church bells in Saint Tremy struck 9 o'clock, their bronze voices carrying across the valley with the same authority they had held before the occupation began. In 2 hours, German patrols would begin their systematic search of the crash site. In 3 hours, they would expand to include nearby farms. The timeline for discovery ticked in Marguerite's mind like her mother's old kitchen clock, relentless, precise, and impossible to stop. The root cellar had been dug by Marguerite's grandfather during the Great War, when German artillery had made above-ground storage dangerous for grain and preserves. Stone walls kept the temperature constant, wooden shelves held what remained of their canned vegetables, and a low ceiling created space that felt hidden even when empty. With Morrison unconscious on a bed of old blankets, the cellar felt smaller and more dangerous than Marguerite had remembered. His breathing echoed against the stone walls. His presence transformed their storage space into something that would require explanation if German soldiers came searching. "How long can we keep this secret?" Claude asked, voicing the question that hung between them like smoke from the crashed aircraft. Marguerite was cleaning the pilot's head wound with water heated on their kitchen stove, her movements careful and methodical despite having no medical training beyond treating injured animals. "Until he heals enough to leave," she said, though both of them understood the optimism in that timeline. Hidden in their cellar, Morrison was completely dependent on their care, their discretion, and their ability to maintain the illusion of normal life while harboring a secret that could get them executed. The pilot's uniform created additional complications. RAF insignia identified him immediately as an enemy combatant. His flying jacket, leather worn soft from use, bore the traces of equipment and maps that suggested he had been engaged in reconnaissance rather than simple bombing runs. If discovered, his presence wouldn't just compromise the Dubois family, it might provide intelligence that could endanger other Allied operations. "We burn the uniform," Claude decided, his practicality asserting itself over sentiment. "Give him farm clothes. If anyone asks, he's your cousin from Paris, recovering from pneumonia." The lie was simple enough to remember, but complex enough to explain Morrison's weakness, his accent if he spoke, and his unfamiliarity with their local area. Marguerite practiced the deception while tending to his injuries, testing different versions of the story until one felt natural enough to survive casual questioning. But as she worked, changing his bloodied shirt for one of her brother's old work clothes, Marguerite realized they had crossed an invisible line between passive resistance and active defiance. For 18 months, they had survived by being unremarkable. Now they were harboring evidence of their loyalty to Germany's enemies in a cellar that could be searched at any moment. The transformation felt both terrifying and exhilarating. After months of helpless watching, they were finally acting. After endless days of pretending normality while their world collapsed, they had chosen a side. Morrison stirred again as Marguerite adjusted the blanket around his shoulders. This time his eyes opened with more focus, taking in the stone walls, the shelves of preserved food, and the young French woman who knelt beside his makeshift bed with antiseptic-stained hands. "Where?" he began in English, then switched to halting French. "Où suis-je?" "Safe," Marguerite replied in French, adding a word of English she had learned from British radio broadcasts. Safe, the word carried more weight than she had intended. Safe meant hidden, fed, and protected from German search parties, but it also meant trapped, dependent, and vulnerable to discovery. For all of them, safety had become inseparable from danger, security from risk. Morrison tried to sit up, winced at the pain from his ribs, and settled back against the blankets with an expression that suggested he understood the complexity of his situation. "Thank you," he said in English, then repeated it in careful French. "Merci." Claude appeared at the cellar entrance, his face showing the strain of divided attention between gratitude for his daughter's courage and fear for their family's survival. "German patrol on the road," he announced quietly. 2 vehicles heading toward the crash site. Through the farmhouse walls, they could hear the distant sound of military engines, the authoritative rhythm of vehicles that didn't need to yield to anything in their path. The search was beginning exactly as Claude had predicted, with systematic efficiency that suggested the Germans had considerable experience locating crashed Allied aircraft. Marguerite looked between her father's worried face and the pilot's grateful eyes, understanding that their brief period of moral clarity was about to be tested by the practical realities of occupation. Keeping Morrison safe would require more than medical care and comfortable lies. It would require the kind of sustained deception that could unravel at the first serious inspection, the first probing question, the first moment when their story failed to convince trained interrogators. But there was no retreat from the choice they had made. Morrison was alive because of their decision, hidden because of their risk, dependent on their continued courage. The path forward led deeper into danger, but it was the only path that allowed them to sleep at night while maintaining their humanity during the day. Outside, the German engines grew louder, then faded as the patrol continued toward the forest. In the cellar, Morrison closed his eyes and settled into sleep that looked more natural than his earlier unconsciousness. Above them, life on the WWII farm continued its carefully practiced routine, but everyone understood that normalcy had become a performance designed to conceal the extraordinary risk they had chosen to embrace. 3 days later, Marguerite had learned to recognize the sound of Morrison's breathing well enough to distinguish sleep from unconsciousness, improvement from decline. His ribs were bruised but not broken, his head wound was healing cleanly, and his strength was returning with the steady nourishment of her cooking and the safety of uninterrupted rest. What she hadn't anticipated was how quickly their farm would become the center of German attention. "Fourth patrol since Tuesday," Claude observed, watching from their kitchen window as another Wehrmacht vehicle turned down the lane that led to their property. "They're being thorough." The official explanation for the increased patrols was routine security inspection following the aircraft crash, but Marguerite suspected the Germans were following a more systematic protocol. Every farm within 5 kilometers of the crash site would be searched, every family questioned, every building examined for signs of concealed enemies or contraband. Sergeant Klaus Weber commanded the local garrison with the methodical competence of a career soldier who understood that occupation duty required different skills than battlefield combat. He had interrogated the Dubois family twice since Morrison's crash, polite questions delivered in decent French, careful observation of their responses, systematic notation of details that might become significant upon later examination. Weber's attention unsettled Marguerite more than crude brutality would have. Brutality could be endured, resisted, or survived, but Weber's intelligence suggested he might notice inconsistencies that would escape less observant officers: the extra food disappearing from their kitchen, the changes in their daily routines, or the subtle signs that their cellar was being accessed more frequently than storage requirements would justify. Morrison had recovered enough strength to whisper basic conversation during Marguerite's visits to the cellar, creating the dangerous intimacy that develops between people sharing mortal risk. He told her about his squadron, based in southern England, about the reconnaissance missions that brought him over occupied France, about the sister in London who wrote letters he might never receive again. In return, Marguerite found herself describing life under occupation: the gradual disappearance of familiar faces, the careful rationing of hope along with food, the daily negotiations between resistance and survival that defined existence in their valley. They spoke in a mixture of French, English, and gestures that created understanding despite linguistic barriers. But their conversations revealed a growing problem that threatened everything Claude and Marguerite had risked to protect Morrison. The pilot was recovering too quickly, growing stronger and more restless with each passing day. His presence in their cellar was becoming unsustainable, but the alternatives, moving him elsewhere or allowing him to attempt escape, carried risks that could destroy not only the Dubois family, but the entire network of quiet resistance that had developed throughout their region. "I can't stay here much longer," Morrison said during one of their evening conversations, his English clear enough that Marguerite understood both the words and their implications. Every day increases the danger for you. He was right, but Marguerite had no solution to offer. The escape networks that might have helped Allied airmen reach neutral territory had been largely dismantled by German counterintelligence operations. The contacts who might have provided false papers or safe transportation had been arrested, executed, or driven into hiding themselves. Morrison's recovery had created an impossible choice. Continue harboring him indefinitely while risking discovery, or release him into a landscape where his survival chances approached zero and his capture would reveal everything about the family that had hidden him. The crisis Marguerite had been unconsciously expecting arrived on Thursday morning, when Sergeant Weber returned to their farm with a larger patrol and a more systematic approach to searching their property. Routine inspection, Weber announced in his careful French, but his manner suggested something beyond routine. His soldiers spread through the farmhouse and outbuildings with practiced efficiency, checking spaces that previous patrols had examined only superficially. Claude maintained the performance of cooperative compliance that had protected them for 18 months, answering questions with the proper mixture of deference and ignorance. But Marguerite watched Weber's methodical progress through their property and realized he was following a specific protocol designed to uncover exactly the kind of secret they were harboring. When Weber's soldiers began examining the barn with particular attention to hidden spaces, Marguerite understood they had been betrayed. Someone had provided information suggesting the Dubois farm warranted more thorough investigation. The timing, the intensity, and the focus of the search indicated German intelligence had received specific intelligence about Allied airmen being hidden in their area. "My men will examine your cellar now," Weber informed Claude with polite formality that carried the weight of absolute authority. The statement wasn't a request requiring permission, but an announcement of action that would proceed regardless of cooperation. Marguerite felt the careful structure of their deception collapsing around the single fact they could not explain away. James Morrison sleeping 20 meters below Weber's boots, wearing her brother's work clothes and breathing the air of a space that would be thoroughly searched within the next 10 minutes. Time compressed into a series of impossible choices. Warn Morrison and hope he could somehow escape detection in a cellar with no alternate exits. Confess their involvement and hope Weber's rumored decency would protect them from the execution that was standard punishment for harboring enemy combatants. Or maintain their innocence and pray that 18 months of practiced invisibility had prepared them for the performance of their lives. Claude caught his daughter's eye with a look that conveyed both apology and determination. They had known this moment might come when they decided to pull Morrison from his crashed aircraft. The choice between their safety and their humanity had been made days ago in the forest. Now they would discover whether courage could be sustained when faced with its likely consequences. Weber moved toward the cellar door with the confident stride of a man who expected to find exactly what his intelligence had suggested would be hidden there. Behind him, his soldiers maintained the disciplined alertness of professionals prepared for resistance, escape attempts, or the kind of desperate violence that discovery sometimes provoked from cornered enemies. In the cellar below, Morrison had surely heard the German voices, the heavy boots, the systematic sounds of a thorough search. Whether he was preparing for capture, concealment, or some form of resistance that might protect his protectors, Marguerite would never know. The next 60 seconds would determine whether their act of moral courage would end in successful defiance or shared destruction. Weber reached for the cellar door handle with deliberate care, his expression revealing nothing about what he expected to find, but everything about his intention to find it thoroughly and completely. The cellar door opened to reveal stone walls, wooden shelves lined with preserved vegetables, and empty space where Morrison should have been sleeping. Weber descended the steps with methodical precision, his flashlight beam sweeping across every corner of the underground storage room while his soldiers maintained position at the entrance above. Marguerite's heart hammered against her ribs as Weber examined the blankets where Morrison had been resting 12 hours earlier, the wooden crate that had served as his table, the corner where his boots had left subtle impressions in the dirt floor. Every trace of the pilot's presence seemed obvious to her: the slightly disturbed dust, the faint depression in the fabric where he had slept, the lingering scent of the antiseptic she had used to clean his wounds. But Weber's inspection revealed nothing more suspicious than a farm family's winter food storage. His flashlight beam lingered on the shelves of canned vegetables, the sacks of grain that represented their carefully hoarded reserves, the ordinary evidence of people preparing to survive another year of occupation hardship. Adequate provisions, Weber observed to Claude, his tone suggesting approval rather than suspicion. You have managed your resources well during difficult times. The German sergeant's methodical search continued for another 10 minutes, examining spaces that could have concealed documents, weapons, or radio equipment. But he found only the normal contents of a working farm's storage areas, tools maintained with care, supplies organized with peasant efficiency, and nothing that suggested involvement in resistance activities. When Weber finally emerged from the cellar, his expression showed the professional disappointment of an experienced officer whose intelligence had proven incorrect. "Your property appears secure," he announced to Claude. "We apologize for the inconvenience." After the German patrol departed, Marguerite waited until their vehicle's engine sounds had faded completely before asking the question that consumed her thoughts. "Where is he?" Claude's slight smile contained 18 months' worth of hidden satisfaction. "Your pilot recovered faster than you realized," he said. "Strong enough to walk, smart enough to understand German voices, and grateful enough to disappear into the forest before endangering the family that saved his life." Morrison had left during the pre-dawn darkness, taking nothing but the farm clothes Marguerite had given him and the small packet of food Claude had prepared for a journey whose destination none of them could predict. No farewell, no expression of gratitude that might compromise their safety if overheard, no promises of reunion that none of them expected to fulfill. But he had left behind a single evidence of his presence: a message written in careful French on a scrap of paper hidden beneath the blanket where he had slept. "Your courage gave me life. I will remember." Signed with initials that identified him not as an enemy combatant, but as a young man whose survival had justified the risks they had chosen to accept. The discovery that Morrison had escaped on his own initiative, rather than endangering them through continued concealment, revealed something about his character that Marguerite found deeply moving. His decision to leave demonstrated the same moral courage they had shown in hiding him, the choice to accept personal risk rather than compromise the safety of others. Over the following weeks, as German attention shifted to other sectors and their farm returned to its practiced invisibility, Marguerite realized the profound transformation their brief defiance had created. For 18 months, they had survived through careful powerlessness. For 1 week, they had chosen meaningful action despite mortal consequences. The change felt permanent and irreversible. Having once acted according to their values rather than their fears, having once chosen someone else's survival over their own safety, having once demonstrated that moral courage was possible even under occupation, they could no longer pretend that passive endurance was their only option. 3 months later, when another Allied airman crashed in the hills east of Saint-Trémy, Claude didn't hesitate before climbing toward the smoke that rose above the forest canopy. The decision had been made months earlier, in a moment of moral clarity that had transformed their understanding of what resistance could mean. This time, Marguerite was ready with medical supplies, prepared food, and a hiding place that had been improved based on lessons learned from Morrison's stay. More importantly, she was ready with the knowledge that ordinary people could choose extraordinary courage, that moral action was possible even under the most dangerous circumstances, and that survival without humanity was a form of defeat more complete than death. The second pilot, a young American navigator named Tommy Chen, required 3 weeks of concealment before connections with surviving resistance networks could arrange his evacuation toward the Swiss border. During those weeks, the Dubois farm became a station on an underground railway that helped Allied airmen return to operational duty. But the transformation that mattered most had occurred during Morrison's brief stay, when Marguerite discovered that the courage she had always possessed could be activated by the simple recognition that some choices were more important than survival. The farm girl who had collected eggs in careful obscurity had become someone willing to risk everything for the principle that human dignity transcended national boundaries, military loyalties, and personal safety. By the war's end, 11 Allied airmen had hidden in the Dubois cellar, each one representing a decision to choose moral courage over practical caution, shared humanity over individual survival. Marguerite kept no record of their names, their nationalities, or their ultimate fates, but she never forgot the lesson Morrison had taught through his grateful disappearance into the forest. That true resistance began not with grand gestures or organized movements, but with individual choices to treat enemies as human beings worthy of protection. The war ended as such wars do, with liberation armies, victory celebrations, and the gradual return of conditions that made heroism unnecessary. But for Marguerite, the most important victory had been won during a single week in 1943, when she learned that moral courage was not a quality some people possessed and others lacked, but a choice available to anyone willing to accept its consequences. In the years that followed, when visitors asked about her experiences during the occupation, Marguerite would speak not about the risks they had endured, but about the transformation they had experienced. "We discovered who we were," she would say, "when we stopped being afraid of who we might become." The farm continued its quiet existence in the valley between two hills, but it was no longer the same place where a 16-year-old girl had collected eggs while airmen died in distant battles. It had become the place where ordinary people had chosen extraordinary courage, where moral clarity had emerged from moral complexity, and where the simple act of treating an enemy pilot as a human being in need had revealed the possibility of resistance that transcended politics, nationalism, and war itself. Morrison never returned to the Dubois farm, but his brief presence had altered its fundamental character in ways that outlasted the occupation, the liberation, and the peace that followed. In choosing to save his life, Marguerite had discovered the courage that would define the rest of her own. In risking everything to hide him, she had learned that some risks were worth taking regardless of their consequences. In letting him go, she had understood that true generosity required no recognition, no gratitude, and no promise of return. The lesson would guide her through the remainder of a long life lived with the quiet confidence of someone who had once faced the choice between survival and humanity, and chosen humanity despite the cost. The pilot had crashed in enemy territory, but the farm girl who risked everything to hide him had discovered that mercy could transform enemies into temporary guardians of each other's dignity, and that such guardianship was the most authentic form of resistance available to ordinary people living through extraordinary times.